The Southern Bridge. There is a particular category of intelligence discovery that does not arrive as a single moment of revelation. It arrives the way a photograph develops in a dark room. Slowly, shapes emerging from nothing, edges sharpening, the full image assembling itself over time until what was once formless becomes undeniable. The analysts who first began pulling threads from a routine signals monitoring operation along the Texas-Mexico border corridor in the spring of a recent year had no reason to believe they were developing a photograph of something that had never been seen before. They were running standard collection protocols on known cartel communication infrastructure. What they were about to find would require an entirely new frame. NSA Cyber operations maintain persistent monitoring posture across known criminal communication nodes throughout the southwest border region. Satellite phone networks, encrypted radio frequencies, cellular infrastructure clustered around high-traffic smuggling corridors. All of it generates signals data that analysts process through pattern recognition systems designed to flag anomalies. Most flagged anomalies resolve into known operational patterns. Cartel logistics communications, enforcement coordination, financial handler check-ins. The vocabulary of organized criminal operations in the border region is, after years of surveillance, largely legible. Analysts know what routine criminal traffic sounds like. What the monitoring system flagged in the spring was not routine criminal traffic. The anomaly was a communications pattern originating from satellite phone handsets registered to a logistics company operating in the Chihuahua region of northern Mexico. The company on paper managed agricultural equipment transport across the northern Mexican states. Its registration documents were legitimate. Its tax filings were current. Its physical address corresponded to an actual warehouse facility. By every surface indicator, it was exactly what it claimed to be. But the satellite phone traffic emanating from handsets registered to this company did not move in patterns consistent with agricultural logistics. The call timing, the duration distributions, the geographic clustering of signal origin points, all of it produced a signature that NSA Cyber's analytical systems flagged as inconsistent with the registered business activity. More specifically, the signature was consistent with personnel coordination operations. The kind of communications pattern generated when multiple individuals are moving groups of people across terrain on a scheduled basis. NSA Cyber assigned a dedicated collection and analysis team to the anomaly. The team's initial mandate was to characterize the communication pattern with greater precision, to determine whether what the system had flagged was genuinely anomalous or a false positive generated by the pattern recognition parameters. Within 3 weeks, the team had produced a preliminary characterization that immediately elevated the investigation's priority. The satellite phone network was not operating alone. It was communicating on encrypted bursts at irregular intervals through relay infrastructure that had been carefully constructed to obscure the signal path. With a second communications node. The second node was not in Mexico. The second node was not in the United States. The second node was geographically located in a region of western Venezuela that had, for several years, been identified by multiple intelligence agencies as an area of elevated interest due to the presence of individuals and organizations connected to Iranian state-sponsored activities in the Western Hemisphere. This was the point at which the developing photograph began to show something recognizable. And what it showed was alarming. NSA Cyber escalated the investigation and brought in additional cryptographic resources to address the encrypted burst communications between the Mexican satellite phone network and the Venezuelan relay node. The encryption was not commercially available software. It was a layered system. A base encryption protocol overlaid with a custom obfuscation layer that scrambled transmission timing and packet structure to defeat standard interception analysis. Breaking it required specialized resources and took 11 weeks of sustained cryptographic effort. When the encryption was broken, the communications history it had been protecting stretched back 22 months. The decoded communications revealed the operational architecture of something that had no precedent in NSA Cyber's existing case files. The organization being described in those messages was not a cartel operation with an Iranian connection. It was a jointly managed, operationally integrated criminal enterprise, a structured partnership between a faction of the Juarez-aligned trafficking network operating in the Chihuahua corridor and a unit operating under direction from the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force, the IRGC's external operations branch. The partnership had a defined organizational structure. On the cartel side, a senior logistics and territorial commander, referred to in decoded communications only by a code designation, controlled the ground infrastructure, the routes, the safe houses, the transport vehicles, the network of guides and enforcers that moved human cargo from collection points in Central America northward through Mexico to staging areas near the U.S. border. On the Iranian side, a unit referred to in communications as the Coordination Office managed a different layer of the operation entirely. The Coordination Office's role, as reconstructed from 22 months of decoded messages, was not purely financial. It was operational. The Coordination Office controlled what the decoded messages called the priority pipeline, a designated channel within the broader human trafficking operation reserved for a specific category of individuals who were not economic migrants or asylum seekers. The priority pipeline moved people who had been specifically selected, vetted, and documented by Iranian state-connected networks in Venezuela, Ecuador, and Turkey. These individuals were given documents, cover identities, and routing through the trafficking network's established infrastructure. They were moved not to be sold or exploited in the way that the network's other victims were. They were moved to reach the United States. Over 22 months of operation, decoded communications documented the movement of 34 individuals through the priority pipeline. The communications did not specify in all cases what these individuals were intended to do after reaching U.S. territory. In some cases, the messages were explicit. Specific cities were identified as destination points, specific contact instructions were included, and in several cases, follow-on operational objectives were referenced in terms that NSA Cyber analysts assessed as consistent with surveillance, network establishment, and pre-operational positioning. In other cases, the messages were deliberately vague, using terminology that indicated the recipients of the information already knew the operational context and did not need it restated. The 34 priority pipeline individuals represented a national security concern of the highest category. But they were not the only victims the network was moving. The broader trafficking operation, the cartel infrastructure that the priority pipeline was embedded within, was, by the metric of human suffering, a catastrophe of independent scale. The decoded communications documented the coordinated movement of between 180 and 240 individuals per month through the network's established routes. These were people who had paid or been paid for by third parties to be transported northward. The conditions of their transport, as referenced in logistical coordination messages, were brutal. Movement was conducted in sealed vehicle compartments for extended periods. Rest stops were minimal. Medical attention was non-existent. The messages referred to transported individuals in dehumanizing numerical terms. Cargo counts, unit figures, load capacities. The financial architecture of the operation was documented across hundreds of decoded messages. The cartel infrastructure received payment in two forms: direct cash payments from migrants or their families, processed through a network of collection agents in Central American cities, and structured payments from the Coordination Office for maintaining and prioritizing the pipeline infrastructure. Total estimated financial flows through the cartel component of the operation, traced through decoded communications referencing payment confirmations and financial handler reports, were approximately $340 million over the 22-month operational period. The Coordination Office's payments to the cartel operation were not large by comparison to the trafficking revenues. They were decoded messages suggested more about purchasing guaranteed capacity and priority access than about funding the operation's baseline costs. NSA Cyber analysts spent 6 weeks after the initial decryption building the complete organizational map. By the time the map was complete, the investigation had identified 312 individuals connected to the operation. Across Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, Ecuador, Venezuela, and nodes in Turkey and Lebanon. The cartel-side network comprised approximately 280 of these individuals operating in structured tiers from senior logistics commanders down to ground-level guides and safe-house operators. The Coordination Office element comprised approximately 32 individuals, the majority of them operating outside U.S. territory, with a smaller number assessed as having already entered the United States through various means. The timeline trigger that transformed the investigation from analytical to operational came from a series of decoded messages exchanged over a 5-day period beginning on a Wednesday. The messages documented the preparation of what the communications called the consolidated movement, a significantly larger than normal operational push through the network's primary route corridor. The consolidated movement was described in coordination messages as involving approximately 340 individuals in transit simultaneously, moving in coordinated groups through 6 waypoint locations across the Chihuahua and Coahuila regions toward 3 border crossing staging areas. The consolidated movement was scheduled to reach its border staging areas within 11 days of the messages being decoded. Embedded within the consolidated movement's traffic, according to decoded communications, were 6 individuals from the priority pipeline, the largest single movement priority pipeline batch the operation had conducted. The messages describing the 6 individuals used different terminology than the standard cargo language applied to other migrants. They were referred to by code numbers linked to separate files, and the coordination messages specified that their crossing was to be managed directly by Coordination Office-connected personnel, rather than standard cartel guides. The consolidated movement, with its embedded priority pipeline batch, gave NSA Cyber's operational partners a defined window and a defined target set. The intelligence package was distributed to the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, the DHS's National Security Investigations Unit, the DEA's Special Operations Division, and, given the explicit connection to IRGC Quds Force operational activities, the intelligence was shared through established channels with the National Counterterrorism Center. The multi-agency task force that assembled around the NSA Cyber intelligence had 9 days before the consolidated movement was scheduled to reach border staging areas. The task force's operational planning confronted a layered challenge. On one level, the objective was to interdict the consolidated movement, to identify and intercept the 340 individuals in transit, separate the priority pipeline individuals from the broader population, and process each case through appropriate investigative and humanitarian channels. On a second level, the objective was to dismantle as much of the network's organizational structure as possible without alerting the Coordination Office to the breach of their communications security. On a third level, and most urgently, the task force needed to locate and account for the estimated 34 individuals who had already passed through the priority pipeline over the preceding 22 months. People who were already inside the United States, at unknown locations with unknown operational mandates. The operational plan developed over 7 days coordinated actions across 4 countries. Executed through diplomatic and law enforcement partnerships with Mexican federal authorities, Guatemalan National Police, and Honduran security forces. NSA Cyber provided real-time monitoring of the encrypted communications network throughout the planning period, flagging any messages that suggested the network had detected investigative interest. No such messages were detected. The consolidated movement's coordination communications continued on schedule. with network commanders providing regular status updates through the same encrypted channels that had been open to NSA Cyber analysts for weeks. The interdiction operations began 8 days after the Consolidated Movement's coordination messages were first decoded. 3 days before the Consolidated Movement was scheduled to reach border staging areas, Mexican federal authorities acting on location intelligence derived from decoded communications identified and secured 4 of the 6 Waypoint safehouse facilities in Chihuahua and Coahuila. The raids on these facilities recovered 247 individuals. Migrants who had been held in conditions that subsequent investigative documentation described as consistent with severe deprivation, including inadequate food and water, no medical care, and physical confinement in spaces not designed for human habitation. Among the 247 individuals recovered from the Waypoint facilities, 4 were identified through documents found on their persons and cross-referenced against priority pipeline communications as belonging to the special category of interest. 2 of the 6 priority pipeline individuals in the Consolidated Movement had not yet reached the Waypoint facilities at the time of the raids. U.S. Customs and Border Protection, operating on coordinates from decoded staging area communications, established enhanced processing operations at 3 border entry points that the network had designated as the Consolidated Movement's crossing targets. Over the 3 days following the Waypoint raids, an additional 89 individuals connected to the Consolidated Movement were encountered and processed at these locations. The 2 remaining priority pipeline individuals were identified among this group on the cartel side of the organizational disruption. Coordinated operations between NSA Cyber informed U.S. federal agencies and Mexican law enforcement resulted in 67 arrests across the network's Mexican operational structure. Senior logistic personnel identified through decoded communications were among those detained. The agricultural equipment company that had provided cover for the satellite phone network was seized. 18 vehicles configured for human transport were recovered. Safehouse facilities at 4 additional locations were secured. The investigation into the 34 individuals who had previously transited the priority pipeline over the preceding 22 months became a separate, ongoing counterintelligence operation managed by the FBI with NSA Cyber analytical support. The decoded communications provided the most detailed investigative foundation that operation could have hoped for. Message threads documenting each of the 34 prior movements, the cover identities and documentation used, the destination cities specified, and in 17 cases follow-on contact instructions that gave investigators significant leads toward locating and assessing the individuals involved. The full scope of what NSA Cyber's 11-week cryptographic effort had exposed was, by any measure, extraordinary. A criminal enterprise that had operated for 22 months without detection, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in trafficking revenue, moving thousands of human beings under brutal conditions, and simultaneously serving as a covert transit infrastructure for individuals operating under Iranian state direction, had been mapped, documented, and dismantled through the patient-sustained application of signal intelligence capabilities. The 340 individuals who were part of the Consolidated Movement, people who had paid money they could not afford or been paid for by networks they may not have fully understood, to be transported northward through routes controlled by people who viewed them as cargo, were alive. Most of them were in conditions that required immediate medical attention. All of them were alive. The 6 priority pipeline individuals embedded in the Consolidated Movement were in federal custody, being processed through counterintelligence and law enforcement protocols appropriate to their specific cases. The Coordination Office's encrypted communications network, which had carried 22 months of operational messages it believed were permanently secure, had been silent since the morning the Waypoint raids began. What it did not know, could not know, because the breach of its communications had never been detected, was that the silence came too late. NSA Cyber had read every message. The operation had been visible for 11 weeks. The consolidated movement, the priority pipeline, the cartel logistics network, the Venezuelan relay node, the coordination office's operational instructions, all of it had been mapped, documented, and shared with the agencies that needed it before the first arrest was made. Signal intelligence does not announce itself. It does not warn the targets of its attention. It reads and records and analyzes and builds the picture. And when the picture is complete, it passes it to the people who can act on what it shows. The Southern Bridge, the name NSA. Cyber analysts had given to the operation during its 11-week developmental phase was never supposed to be found. It was constructed with enough layers of cover and enough communication security investment to operate indefinitely. The people who built it believed that the distance between a satellite phone in Chihuahua and an encrypted relay node in western Venezuela was, in practical terms, infinite, that no signal's capability could bridge that gap and read what they were saying to each other. They miscalculated the distance. NSA Cyber bridged it in 11 weeks. What was on the other side changed everything the agencies involved understood about the threat operating along the southern corridor, and gave them the tools to begin addressing what 22 months of undetected operation had already put in motion. The photograph, fully developed, showed something unprecedented. It also showed a path forward. Signals don't lie. They carry exactly what was sent. And what was sent over 22 months of messages that were supposed to be unreadable was a complete operational history of something that should never have existed. And that, because of NSA, Cyber's sustained analytical effort would not exist much longer. Suman. This is a fictional dramatization inspired by signal intelligence and cyber operations concepts. No real cases, individuals, specific methods, or NSA operations are depicted. All characters, organizations, operational details, events, and geopolitical scenarios described are entirely fictitious and are used solely for narrative and illustrative purposes.